Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is revolution. The year is 1775, it's June, and Washington has just received his commission as the commanding general of the Continental Army. The Americans are fighting the British primarily in and around Boston, where they've actually been at war for the last couple of months. Battles at Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. And Washington is now sent by Congress to create a national army to fight against the British instead of just the local militia who had been doing the job to date. So Washington arrives in Boston in early July, and he finds himself not an army, but a collection of farmers. These are people who had just grabbed their own personal muskets, the clothes on their back, and they answered the call of the community to fight against the tyrannical British in and around the area of Boston. Washington has a huge task ahead of him, not only to deal with the British, who are ensconced within the city of Boston and they have control of the Boston harbor. The colonials have them kind of surrounded, so it's a bit of a stalemate in a siege-like environment. But Washington has to do something to really establish an army. He needs to put in discipline. He needs to put in a chain of command. He needs to break apart some of the closeness of the local militia to create this national environment, to have a national attack against the British. Well, Washington has some things going for him. First of all, he looks the part. Washington, he's 6'2", over 200 pounds, in his early 40s, in the prime of his life. He's a strong man. He's one of the best horsemen in all of North America, and he brings an aura of authority with him, both from his personal military experience when he was fighting with the British back in the 1750s, although nothing like the responsibility he has now, but also he's been in command of his large plantation. He's used to being in charge of things, and that comes across, and it does begin to bring some solid notion of what a national army might look like under his command. Well, he has to figure out what to do with the British. He has an idea to send one of his new leaders, Henry Knox, who up until a few months ago was a bookseller in the city of Boston. All he'd done in the military was read about it. But Washington sends Knox to New York, to Fort Ticonderoga, where he takes the fort, but more importantly, he takes their cannon and the shot, and he drags them across the frozen ground several hundred miles back to Boston to give Washington an opportunity now to do something militarily against the British. He's still in his line right now, a little bit too far away, so he creates an environment where one night, quietly, they bring all of this cannon onto Dorchester Heights. This is the southern tip of Boston, and it gives him command of the city and of the harbor. The British are now in trouble. They realize it, and they actually propose to Washington a bit of a deal. We'll leave town and not burn this city, but you got to let us go. Washington's instincts are to attack, but he realizes if he does attack, the city will be burned. It will be bad for morale of the supporters in the city, and the British are going to get away anyway. So he lets them go. It's a victory, proud throughout the colonies, although it's not necessarily a military victory because there was no actual fight. The real fight is going to be in the next location, and Washington correctly anticipates that General William Howe, the commander of the British, are going to bring his forces to New York. It's the largest ports, and also New York has the largest contingent of loyalists to the crown. So Washington brings his men and he sets them up. He kind of splits his command. He sets up his troops in a far too scattered way. It's not very well constructed. So when the British land on Long Island, they start marching right through the Americans. First of all, in hundreds of ships, they bring thousands of soldiers. This is the largest armada that North America certainly has ever seen, and the Americans are simply no match. And Washington's tactics, one way or another, this is not going to stop the British. In fact, things are looking really bad. On a pouring rain at night on the Brooklyn Heights, the British are within a couple of days probably of annihilating the entire American army. So Washington decides to skedaddle out of there. He collects up every boat he can get his hands on, and again at night, quietly escapes, does not lose a man, off to Manhattan. Now, the British are on their heels, and Washington, in fact, again, delays too long in getting his folks out of New York. And he loses Fort Washington and 3,000 men, in part because he was too slow to make the decision to retreat. So Washington is at a real low point as they do escape New York, often to New Jersey. But he says at the time, "Such is my situation that if I were to wish the bitterest curse to an enemy this side of the grave, I should put him in my stead with my feelings. I see the impossibility of serving with reputation or doing any essential service to the cause by continuing in command, and yet I am told that if I quit the command, inevitable ruin will follow. I was never in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born." But Washington also is in learning mode, and he realizes that he needs to change tactics. Washington's instincts are aggressive. He wants to take the fight to the British, but he realizes that his army that he's just now cobbling together is simply no match for the powerful British army, which is the most powerful army on the planet. And so he decides to make a change in his strategy. And he writes that on our side, the war should be defensive. It has ever been called a war of posts, that we should on all occasions avoid a general action or put anything to the risk unless compelled by a necessity into which we ought never to be drawn is evident. He realizes that if he can stay out of a major loss, they can stick around long enough to perhaps have victory in the end against the British. Well, he's also not 100% content not to fight at all, because now he's worried about morale. Heading into December of 1776, he's got short-term enlistments. Most of his army is about to disappear on January 1st. So he comes up with a bold plan. Across the Delaware River into New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey, is a small town where about 1,000 foreign soldiers, Hessians, hired German mercenaries who are fighting on behalf of King George. They're in there. It's Christmas night. They're not expecting a thing. And Washington comes up with this plan to attack. It's actually a really complicated plan, perhaps too complicated. 2/3 of his groups do not actually make it across the Delaware, which is, yes, the river is flowing, but there's large chunks of ice making it a very hazardous crossing. Washington personally leads the crossing of the Delaware, and sure enough, they surprise the Hessians on Christmas morning, and it's a tremendous success. A total of 22 killed for the Hessians, 83 wounded, and nearly 900 captured. Well, Washington loses 2 men and only 5 injured, although one of those was a teenager by the name of James Monroe, the future president. But by and large, this is an amazing success for the bold and audacious George Washington and his plucky little colonial soldiers. Morale has got a huge boost. It's boosted even further the following week when Washington follows this up with a raid in Princeton, New Jersey. European countries are taking notice. Washington and his men are now on a high as they head into winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. More soldiers start showing up, more volunteers, enlistments are getting longer. This is now going from the lows of New York into much more of a high note. The next fighting season occurs in the middle of 1777. General Howe decides he's going to take the U.S. capital, Philadelphia. Washington gets his troops in position to try to defend the city. They do the best they can, but they're simply outmatched. There's nothing Washington can do to plug enough holes, and eventually they have to retreat while the British take the capital and the U.S. Congress escapes off to York, Pennsylvania. Washington takes his men to Valley Forge, freezing cold Valley Forge, where they have no place to live. They have to build huts. A lot of their men are without uniform. They're malnourished because they don't have enough food. This is, again, a disastrously low point for the colonial army. For George Washington, well, just 20 or 30 miles away, the British are having a nice time in the U.S. capital of Philadelphia. Once again, it's a low point. Washington reaches out to Congress where he says, "Yesterday, fresh and more powerful reasons oblige me to add that I am now convinced, beyond a doubt, that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these 3 things: starve, dissolve, or disperse, in order to obtain subsistence in the best manner they can. Rest assured, sir, this is not an exaggerated picture, but that I have abundant reason to support what I say. Washington's worried he's going to have any kind of an army coming out of Valley Forge, but finally the weather clears and the Americans actually take some time to drill and start to become more of an army. At least those that survive the horrific winter are actually ready for battle. Well, Washington is observing what's happening with the British. Couple of points. A major victory for the Americans, not under George Washington. A much bigger victory than what happened in Trenton is off in Saratoga, New York, where an entire British army is captured by the Americans, Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, the generals in charge, and this actually is a catalyst to get France to commit to the war. So there's positive news coming there. Again, Washington and his men are drilling and becoming more of an army, and they see that the new commander for the British, because General Howe was recalled after the loss of Saratoga, it's Henry Clinton who takes over, and he says, you know what, I'm heading back to New York. And he's going to travel by land from Philadelphia to New York. The generals around Washington are basically saying, let them go. This is too dangerous to fight out in the open. But Washington, again, still has those aggressive instincts. And he decides to launch an assault in an area around Monmouth Courthouse. And he has Charles Lee, his second in command, take the army into the field. Now, Lee was not that enthusiastic about the fight. And he kind of goes into it half-hearted, and it's a bit of a rout. The British immediately repulse the Americans, who are into a quick retreat. Well, Washington learns about this and is angered, and he rides in and he confronts Lee, and he does something that he almost never, ever does. He curses him out right there in the middle of the field of battle. General Scott recalled that Washington cursed till the leaves shook on the tree. He called it charming, delightful. Never have I enjoyed such swearing before or since. Washington relieves Lee and he takes command of the field with Lafayette by his side, and he literally rides himself into the thick of the retreat and forces, through his own will, his men to turn around to fight. And while they don't win the day, the Battle of Monmouth turns out to be a draw. It's actually one of Washington's most heroic moments in the Revolutionary War, while he takes this sure defeat and at least turns it into a stalemate, a draw, and it was his personal willpower which is starting to continue to build that aura of George Washington as the indispensable man leading the Americans in this fight. Well, it's now at a point where the British are back in New York. Washington has them surrounded, and it's only 1778, but it's the last fight that would really take place in the northern part of the colonial territory, and Washington wouldn't see another pitched battle until Yorktown in 1781. That's the story for another day. That is George Washington and Revolution from the life of George Washington. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.